Imagine standing at the edge of the ocean, at a place where the water is unnaturally still. No waves breaking, no boats passing, just a vast, silent surface stretching to the horizon. Now imagine that beneath that surface, far below where light no longer reaches, there are streets. Not ruins scattered by time, not debris from a shipwreck, but streets laid out with intention, foundations aligned with precision, walls that once enclosed homes, temples, public squares, a city. No one lives there now. No voices, no movement, only pressure and darkness. And yet, the idea of this place refuses to sink. For more than 2,000 years, people have whispered its name, not as a confirmed location, not as a proven discovery, but as something unfinished. Atlantis, a city said to have been powerful, advanced, wealthy beyond imagination, and then gone. No gradual decline, no slow abandonment recorded in detail, no survivors leaving behind clear testimony, just disappearance. And that is what makes the story dangerous, because history is comfortable with destruction. We understand war. We understand conquest. We understand cities burned, empires overrun, civilizations replaced. But disappearance without a clear ending, that unsettles us. Because if a city can vanish without witnesses, without ruins easily visible, without a final chapter written anywhere, then what does that say about what history remembers or forgets? Atlantis is often dismissed as myth, a fable, a philosophical invention. And maybe it is. But here, the problem. Myths don't usually come with precise descriptions. They don't include measurements. They don't describe geography, architecture, political systems, or sudden environmental catastrophe in such detail. And myths rarely endure this long, without evolving into something else entirely. Atlantis didn't fade with time. It followed us, through medieval maps, through Renaissance speculation, through modern archaeology, geology, and oceanographic surveys. It resurfaced again and again, whenever humans began asking uncomfortable questions about power, collapse, and hubris. So tonight, we're not here to prove Atlantis existed, and we're not here to dismiss it either. We're here to do something more difficult. We're here to follow the evidence, and the absence of evidence, to trace where the story begins, where it breaks down, and why, after centuries of skepticism and research, the question still refuses to go away. Because whether Atlantis was a real city, a distorted memory of catastrophe, or a warning disguised as history, there is one fact that cannot be ignored. If Atlantis never existed, why does it still feel like something was lost? Every investigation has a starting point, and with Atlantis, that point is uncomfortable, because it is narrow. There is no chorus of ancient witnesses, no scattered references across civilizations, no competing origin stories carved into stone. There is one voice. The entire story of Atlantis enters history through the writings of Plato, a philosopher, not a historian. And that matters. Plato describes Atlantis in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These are not adventure stories. They are not epics. They are philosophical conversations, which immediately raises a problem. When philosophers tell stories, they are often teaching something, not mapping coastlines. According to Plato, the account of Atlantis was ancient even in his time. He claims it was passed down through generations, from Egyptian priests to a Greek lawgiver to Plato's own family, a chain of memory stretching back 9,000 years before his lifetime. That number alone has troubled scholars for centuries. Because 9,000 years before Plato places Atlantis in a time long before classical civilizations, before most known urban societies in the Mediterranean. And yet, Plato describes Atlantis not as primitive. He describes it as advanced, deliberately planned, politically organized, militarily powerful. A civilization with concentric harbors, massive architecture, and a ruling class obsessed with wealth, dominance, and expansion. Then, in a single, devastating sequence, Atlantis is said to have been destroyed. Not conquered, not occupied, but overwhelmed by earthquakes, by floods, by the sea itself. And within a single day and night, it vanished beneath the surface. That description has fueled centuries of speculation. But before we go any further, we need to confront a harder question. What kind of story was Plato actually telling? Plato was known for using allegory, fictional narratives designed to explore moral truth. He wrote about ideal societies, failed societies, the dangers of arrogance and excess. Atlantis, in his telling, is not merely a place. It is a contrast, a powerful empire that lost its virtue and was punished for it, opposed to an idealized ancient Athens, disciplined, restrained, morally superior. That framing alone makes historians uneasy, because it suggests Atlantis may have been shaped, or even invented, to serve a philosophical purpose. And yet, Plato does something strange. He insists the story is true. He does not present Atlantis as a hypothetical. He does not label it a fable. He claims it as history, ancient history, forgotten by the Greeks, but preserved by Egyptian records. And this is where the ground becomes unstable. Because if Plato was inventing Atlantis, he went to unusual lengths to anchor it. He gives measurements, geographic orientation, political structure. He names metals, describes architecture, details how power was distributed. These are not the vague gestures of myth. But neither are they proof. No Egyptian record of Atlantis has ever been found. No inscription, no papyrus, no monument, and no other Greek writer, not Herodotus, not Thucydides, mentions Atlantis at all. Which leads us to an uncomfortable crossroads. Either Plato preserved a memory of a real catastrophe, filtered through centuries of retelling, or he created one of the most enduring fictional civilizations in human history, so convincing that it refuses to stay fictional. And here's the part most summaries leave out. Plato never finished the Atlantis story. The dialogue ends abruptly. Mid-description. Mid-sentence. There is no final reflection. No aftermath. No philosophical conclusion. Just silence. That unfinished ending has haunted scholars almost as much as the city itself, because it mirrors the fate of Atlantis. A story that begins confidently, offers detail, then stops. So before we ask where Atlantis was, before we ask whether it sank, we have to ask something far more basic. Was Atlantis meant to be found, or meant to be questioned? Because if the foundation of the story itself is unstable, then every theory built on top of it inherits that instability. And yet, people have kept searching, not because the evidence is strong, but because the idea is powerful. Which brings us to the next problem. If Atlantis was real, where should it have been? And why does its supposed location create more contradictions than clarity? To understand Atlantis, we have to do something that feels almost unfair. We have to examine the messenger, not to dismiss him, but to understand what kind of truth he dealt in. Plato was not a chronicler in the modern sense. He didn't write history the way an archivist writes it. He wrote dialogues, conversations built to test ideas under pressure. And in those dialogues, he often built worlds that weren't meant to be visited. They were meant to be examined. Plato's work repeatedly returns to one question. What happens when a society gains power faster than it gains restraint? That's not archaeology. That's ethics. And Atlantis, in the way he frames it, behaves less like a location and more like a warning. A civilization described as rich, confident, expanding, and then morally corroded from within. Opposite it, he places an idealized Athens. Disciplined, balanced, defended by principle rather than excess. Not a neutral comparison. A deliberate contrast. It's tempting to stop there and label Atlantis as fiction. A political parable. A dramatic mirror held up to Plato's own world. But the story doesn't make it that easy. Because Plato does something unusual. He insists on lineage. He doesn't say, consider this imaginary example. He says, in effect, this was told to us. He anchors Atlantis inside a chain of transmission. From priests, to visitors, to family memory, to his page. A story that arrives already aged. That chain is where suspicion and possibility live together. On one side, it can be read as a credibility device, a way to make a moral narrative feel authoritative. On the other, it resembles something historians recognize: how real events survive when official archives fail. A disaster can be remembered as a tale. A tale can harden into tradition. Tradition can become history simply by being repeated long enough. And Plato's Atlantis is full of the kind of detail that keeps people hesitating before they dismiss it. It contains structure, a political system, a geography, a sequence of events, a defined ending. The precision is not proof, but it is persuasive. So the question becomes, what was Plato's purpose? If Atlantis is a moral contrast, why wrap it in the language of inherited record? If it's only an invented example, why insist it came from somewhere older? And if it did come from somewhere older, what happened to the original source? No surviving Egyptian record explicitly confirms Atlantis. No independent Greek author discusses it as an external fact. No archaeological site rises from the sea and settles the debate, which leaves us with a more delicate possibility that Plato did what skilled storytellers often do. He took something real enough to feel familiar, then shaped it into something meaningful enough to endure. Not a pure invention, not a strict report, a transformation. A coastal community experiences a sudden flood. A volcanic eruption darkens skis and breaks trade. A powerful state weakens, then fractures. People relocate, rebuild, retell. A generation later, the memory isn't a technical account. It's a story. And the story begins to carry values. Pride punished. Arrogance corrected. Wealth drowned. That doesn't make it false. It makes it filtered. And yet, the most unsettling element is how the Atlantis story stops. Not with a conclusion. Not with a tidy moral. The dialogue breaks off. A city swallowed. A narrative interrupted. A vanishing described in a text that itself vanishes mid-thought. So here's the dilemma we carry forward. If Plato fabricated Atlantis completely, he created a myth so structured it behaves like history. If he altered something that happened, he may have buried the original event inside a moral frame. Either way, certainty slips. What if Plato didn't invent Atlantis? What if he reshaped a real disaster into a lesson? If Atlantis was only an idea, its location wouldn't matter. But Plato gives us geography, and geography is dangerous because it invites verification. According to the account, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a phrase ancient readers understood as a boundary of the known world. Today, those pillars are commonly associated with the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic. To Plato's audience, this was not a poetic flourish. It was a real threshold. Beyond it lay the unknown. Open ocean. Unmapped territory. A place where certainty ended. So Atlantis, we are told, was not hidden within familiar waters. It was outside them. And then Plato adds another destabilizing detail. He describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia combined. If taken literally, Atlantis would have been enormous, larger than entire regions known to the ancient world. Such a landmass does not simply vanish without leaving unmistakable traces. No continental fragment that size has disappeared in the last 10,000 years. No tectonic evidence supports it. No ocean floor structure matches that scale, which forces an uncomfortable realization. Either Plato exaggerated, or the words we read today are not identical to the words first spoken. Or Libya and Asia meant something more limited in his time. Plato describes concentric rings of land and water. A central island. Canals cut with precision. Harbors capable of holding fleets. The city is engineered. Yet no known, ancient map aligns cleanly with this description. Not in the Atlantic. Not in the Mediterranean. Not in North Africa. Not along the European coast. Every proposed location fits some details and violates others. Then there is the problem of time. Plato places Atlantis thousands of years before his own era. And yet, the society he describes resembles civilizations that flourished much later. With complex bureaucracy, advanced metallurgy, and large-scale architecture. And then there's the sea itself. Plato claims the destruction of Atlantis made the surrounding waters impassable, choked with mud and debris. But oceanographic studies show no such enduring barrier. Again, something almost fits, then fails at the edges. This is why Atlantis resists closure. Not because nothing aligns, but because too many things almost do. If the location doesn't fit the map we know, what does? If Atlantis was not an invention, if it was a memory reshaped by time, then somewhere in the ancient world, something catastrophic must have happened. Not a slow decline, not a quiet migration, but an event violent enough to fracture memory itself. This is where many researchers pause and turn toward the Aegean Sea, toward a crescent-shaped island that once looked very different. Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera. Around the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Santorini experienced one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. Entire landmasses collapsed inward. Ash columns rose miles into the sky. Shockwaves rippled across the sea. What remained was a flooded caldera, a ring of land encircling deep water. Tsunamis surged outward, slamming into coastlines hundreds of miles away. Ash-blanketed fields. Sunlight dimmed. Agriculture faltered. And nearby, one of the most sophisticated Bronze Age societies in the Mediterranean began to unravel. The Minoan civilization. The Minoans were not obscure. They built multi-story palaces, engineered plumbing systems, traded across vast maritime networks. They dominated the seas, without massive fortifications, a power built on commerce and naval reach. Their cities were colorful, planned, and vibrant. And after the eruption, they were changed. Ports were destroyed. Fleets were lost. Trade routes fractured. The society did not vanish overnight, but its dominance did. This is why the Santorini hypothesis is compelling. It offers a sudden natural catastrophe, massive flooding, seismic destruction, and a powerful maritime culture brought low. But then the fractures appear. The Minoans were not located beyond the Pillars of Heracles. They were inside the Mediterranean. The Minoan world does not match the vast empire Plato describes. And while Santorini was devastated, the people did not disappear entirely. So we're left with an unsettling truth. The strongest candidate still doesn't quite fit. Santorini gives us a catastrophe that almost fits, but almost isn't evidence. So the next step is the one that disciplines every mystery. We ask what the ground can actually confirm, not what we want to be true, not what sounds plausible, not what feels like a perfect story. What survives? Atlantis, if it existed as a physical city, would leave signatures. Stone does not vanish politely. Cities do not dissolve without residue. Even when water rises, even when structures collapse, patterns remain. Foundations, collapsed masonry, distinctive ceramics. tool marks, harbor works, settlement debris. And over the last century, archaeology has become exceptionally good at finding those signatures. On land, under jungle, beneath desert, even underwater. So what has it found? Not Atlantis. Not a single confirmed underwater ruin that matches Plato's description. In scale, layout, and cultural footprint, there are submerged structures, yes. There are drowned ancient coastlines, harbors, quays, and settlements. But nothing that stands up as the Atlantean capital. Nothing that clearly fits the concentric city design, the vast empire, the sudden obliteration in one day and night. And this is where the dream of Atlantis collides with a harder truth. If an advanced civilization once ruled the world and vanished globally, it would leave a trail too large to miss. Because technology leaves debris. Mining leaves scars. Metalworking leaves slag. Construction leaves quarries. Trade leaves distribution patterns. Population leaves burials, waste, and durable artifacts. A globally dominant civilization doesn't disappear without leaving a global footprint. And archaeology, across continents, does not show that footprint. Instead, what it reveals again and again is something less dramatic and more unsettling in a different way. Most collapses are not instantaneous. They unfold. Systems strain. Trade weakens. Rulers lose authority. Cities shrink. People move. The structures remain standing long after the political center fails. The ending is gradual, not cinematic. And this is why Atlantis has such trouble surviving in the archaeological record. Because Plato's Atlantis doesn't decline. It is erased. But archaeology rarely sees erasure. It sees transformation. A city's administrative quarter goes quiet. Ritual centers stop being maintained. Housing patterns change. Populations spread into smaller communities. Even catastrophes, earthquakes, floods, eruptions, tend to produce mixed outcomes. Some areas are destroyed. Others persist. People rebuild, relocate, adapt. A society may lose power without losing existence. And Atlantis, if taken literally, demands a kind of clean disappearance that the real world seldom provides. So at this point, a skeptical researcher would say, there is no Atlantean ruin because Atlantis is not a place. It is a narrative tool, a cautionary tale, a philosophical architecture made of words. That interpretation is reasonable. But then archaeology complicates the skepticism too. Because archaeology has its own blind spots. Not because it's careless. Because the earth is vast. And the ocean is bigger. We have mapped only a fraction of the seafloor in high detail. We know that entire ancient coastlines lie underwater due to sea level rise. We know that human societies often hugged shorelines. For trade, fishing, transport, fertile delta soils. And we know that coastlines are where archaeology is most vulnerable. Because water does not preserve the same way Earth does. Currents scatter. Sediments bury. Salt corrodes. And some regions remain inaccessible, either technologically or politically. So archaeology pushes back in two directions at once. It tells us there is no confirmed Atlantis, but it also warns us absence of evidence is not proof of non-existence. especially when your target lies underwater, beneath shifting sand, or on a drowned coastline. This is where the mystery regains oxygen. Not because we suddenly have a new clue, but because we are forced to admit the map might still be incomplete. Atlantis may not be missing. We may be searching with the wrong assumptions. Because here is the unspoken trap of the Atlantis debate. Most people search for a spectacular city because the story is spectacular. But real ancient cities were often modest at first. They grew slowly. Their greatness existed more in systems than in glittering monuments. And if Atlantis began as a smaller coastal society later, inflated by retelling, its material remains might not look like what people expect. It might look ordinary. A harbor wall, a collapsed breakwater, a drowned settlement. Not a shining empire, but the seed of one, magnified by memory. So the question becomes less romantic and more unsettling. What if Atlantis isn't missing because it never existed? What if it's missing because we're not trained to recognize it? What if we're searching for a legend instead of searching for a human pattern? A civilization that suffered a catastrophe, migrated, and left behind a partial submerged trace. And that leads to the next turning point. Because to understand what might be hidden underwater, we have to understand how much of the ancient world is already underwater. Not imaginary, not mythic, real coastlines that are gone. What if we're looking in the wrong places? To understand why Atlantis refuses to disappear, we have to confront a fact that changes the entire discussion. The world Plato lived in was not the world we live in now. Not geographically, not coastally, not underwater. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, global sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than they are today. That number matters because it means vast areas of land that once existed no longer do. Coastlines shifted outward for kilometers. River deltas extended farther into the sea. Islands were larger. Plains connected landmasses, now separated by water. And critically, those coastlines were where humans preferred to live. Fishing, trade, transportation, fertile soils. The sea was not a boundary. It was a highway. So when the ice melted, the ocean didn't just rise. It erased. Slowly. Relentlessly. Without spectacle. Entire landscapes slipped beneath the waterline over generations. No tsunami. No single disaster. Just a shoreline that never came back. Modern archaeology confirms this again and again. Submerged settlements off the coast of India. Stone tools beneath the North Sea. In what is now called Doggerland, once a massive habitable plain, connecting Britain to mainland Europe. Ancient ports beneath the Mediterranean. Drowned villages in Southeast Asia. Sunken habitation, sites off the coasts of Africa and the Americas. These places were not myths. They were lived in, and then they were lost. Which introduces a dangerous possibility. If entire regions of human activity are now underwater, then absence on land does not mean absence in history. It means displacement. Plato describes Atlantis as an island civilization that existed before recorded Greek history. If that claim is taken seriously, not literally, but structurally, it places Atlantis in a time window when sea levels were still rising and coastlines were still unstable. A time when memory would have been oral, when stories traveled across generations, not inscriptions, when details blurred as they were retold. In that context, exaggeration is not deception. It's compression. Centuries of change folded into narrative. Distances stretched. Sizes enlarged. Events condensed into symbolism. A real place doesn't need to be perfectly remembered to be remembered at all. And this is where the Atlantis debate quietly shifts. Because the question stops being, did Atlantis exist exactly as Plato described it? And becomes, could Plato's Atlantis be a distorted memory of something real? Something coastal, ancient, and now underwater? If a society was displaced by rising seas, its survivors wouldn't say, our shoreline retreated gradually due to post-glacial meltwater pulses. They would say, the sea took our land. If a city disappeared beneath waves over generations, the story would not preserve incremental loss. It would preserve trauma, a before and an after. And that trauma, passed down, reshaped, moralized, could evolve into myth without becoming false. It could become symbolic without becoming fictional. This is the narrow path where Atlantis becomes most dangerous to dismiss. Not because it proves the city existed as described, but because it suggests the story may encode a real experience of loss, filtered through time, philosophy, and human memory. Still, caution matters. Because rising sea levels explain disappearance, they do not explain scale. They do not explain global power. They do not explain an empire larger than Libya and Asia combined. And this is where memory complicates everything. Human recollection does not preserve proportion. It preserves meaning. A local catastrophe can feel universal to those who lived through it. So Atlantis may not represent a world-spanning civilization. It may represent something smaller, older, and closer to home. A society whose loss felt total, because it erased everything familiar. And that brings us to the most unsettling possibility yet. Atlantis may not be false. It may be misremembered. A real place magnified by time. A real disaster reframed as warning. A real loss transformed into allegory. Which leaves us with the question that refuses to settle. Could Atlantis be real, but remembered wrong? And if so, where would that leave the search? Because once we accept that possibility, the map changes again. And the next candidates are no longer mythic. They are controversial and deeply uncomfortable. Even if the ocean has erased coastlines, even if a real catastrophe could be hiding behind the legend, we still have to face the most difficult possibility: that Atlantis was never meant to be found. Not because Plato was being dishonest, but because he was doing something else entirely. He was building a warning. Plato lived in a world that had seen greatness collapse. He watched Athens rise into power, expand, dominate, and then suffer humiliation and loss. He lived in the aftershock of the Peloponnesian War, in a city wrestling with what it had become. And in times like that, stories do not function as entertainment. They function as diagnosis. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, reads like a case study in hubris. A society blessed with abundance, fertile land, mineral wealth, maritime access, expansionist reach, and yet unable to restrain itself. It grows powerful faster than it grows wise. It begins with order, then slides into excess. And excess becomes decay. Not physical decay, moral decay. Plato repeatedly returns to the relationship between power and discipline. In his philosophy, the collapse of a society often begins long before the collapse of its walls. It begins when a society no longer governs itself, when appetite replaces judgment, when dominance becomes identity, when wealth becomes entitlement. Atlantis is constructed to embody that trajectory, and against it, Plato sets an idealized Athens. Not the Athens he knew, but an ancient, purified version of it. A society that values balance, restraint, civic virtue. In Plato's story, Athens is small but principled. Atlantis is grand but corrupted. And in the end, the grand one is swallowed. That structure is unmistakably philosophical. It is not simply, here is a lost island. It is, here is what happens when a civilization believes it is untouchable. Here is what happens when power stops being a tool and becomes a craving. Here is what happens when a society confuses expansion with progress. This is where Atlantis stops behaving like geography and starts behaving like political theory, a dramatic demonstration, a myth that carries an argument. And when you look at it that way, many odd features of the story make sense. The exaggeration, the immense scale, the sudden, total punishment. This is not how the physical world usually behaves, but it is how moral narratives behave. They sharpen, they simplify, they impose consequence. They turn slow corruption into sudden reckoning, so the listener feels the lesson. And that might be the point. Not to leave a map for future explorers, but to leave a warning for future societies. A warning that would still be readable, even after the details became uncertain. Because the details are not the payload. The payload is the pattern of ascent, the pattern of arrogance, the pattern of collapse. Still, the metaphor interpretation carries discomfort, because even a metaphor has to be built from something. Writers draw from reality, from memory, from what their audience already recognizes as plausible. If Plato wanted to warn Athens about imperial ambition, why choose a drowned island empire? Why reach for catastrophe? Some scholars argue the answer is simple. Because a drowned city cannot fight back. It cannot contradict. It cannot be politically inconvenient. A vanished empire is safe to condemn. It is a blank canvas for moral instruction. But that leads to another possibility. That Atlantis is both safe and familiar. Safe because it cannot be checked easily. Familiar because it may echo real disasters that people still remembered, even faintly. If coastal communities across the Mediterranean had stories of land lost to the sea, of waves taking settlements, of islands shattered by earthquakes, then Plato's audience would not hear Atlantis as pure fantasy. They would hear it as plausible. So we arrive at the question beneath coordinates. Can something be meaningful and real at the same time? Once a mystery survives long enough, it doesn't stay in one category. It stops belonging to historians alone. It escapes into culture. And when it does, the question changes. It's no longer only, where was Atlantis? It becomes, where do people need Atlantis to be? Atlantis becomes a canvas, a shape that can be moved across the world and repainted to fit whatever the era fears or wants. Atlantis in Antarctica. On the surface, it sounds impossible, but the theory survives by leaning on an idea that Antarctica was once warm, ice-free, and habitable, and that a great civilization could have existed there before climate buried it beneath ice. These claims are debated, contested, and widely questioned by mainstream science. But the reason they persist is not always scientific. It's narrative. Antarctica is the perfect hiding place, the farthest elsewhere on Earth. Then there's Atlantis in the Azores, a chain of volcanic islands in the Atlantic. This theory appeals because it seems to align with Plato's placement beyond the Pillars of Heracles. People look at the mid-Atlantic ridge and imagine a lost landmass, fractured and submerged. A seductive narrative. But geology doesn't easily support a recent sinking continent of that scale. And then there's the advanced lost civilization claim. The idea that Atlantis was not a single island, but the remnant of a global high civilization, wiped out by catastrophe. It feels like it explains everything at once. But the weakness is also simple. A global advanced society would leave global industrial evidence. And archaeology, so far, does not show that. Still, these ideas endure because they offer something powerful. Closure. A definite location. A definite cause. A definite story. And certainty is comforting, even when it's not deserved. Which brings us to the question, beneath all these claims, why do we want Atlantis to be real so badly? By this point, something should feel clear. Not about Atlantis itself, but about us. Because after centuries of debate, Atlantis is still here. Not on any confirmed map, not in any agreed location, but in the human imagination. Stories don't survive this long by accident. They survive because they adapt. Atlantis represents loss. Not the personal kind, but civilizational loss. The fear that something vast and meaningful can disappear faster than anyone expects. It also carries nostalgia. Not for a real place, necessarily, but for an imagined golden age. A world lost before it could disappoint us. And then there is the warning. Atlantis vanishes because it overreaches. Because power outruns wisdom. That message never grows outdated. It simply finds new targets. Mystery thrives where evidence thins. If Atlantis were definitively proven false, it would lose its power. If it were definitively proven real, it would lose its ambiguity. Its endurance depends on remaining unresolved. Which brings us to a final thought. What if the truth of Atlantis is less important than the question it keeps alive? We've traveled as far as the evidence allows. through philosophy and geography, through catastrophe and coastline, through archaeology, skepticism, and the stories people tell when answers don't arrive. And now we reach the edge. The point where certainty stops being available. Atlantis cannot be proven. There is no agreed location, no confirmed ruins, no artifacts that carry its name, in a way the world can verify. But it also cannot be fully dismissed, because the story has survived too long, in too structured a form, to be treated like a simple invention and forgotten. So let's return to the image we began with. Imagine the ocean again. The surface calm, the light fading as you descend, down into the place where pressure replaces air, where sound becomes distant, where the world feels older than language. And somewhere below, maybe nothing, maybe only rock and sand, or maybe the outline of something human that no longer has a name. A wall, a foundation, a street swallowed by time. So here is the final question, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet disturbance to carry with you. If a city vanished without leaving ruins, would we even recognize it as history? If this kind of evidence-based mystery is what you enjoy, stories that stay careful, atmospheric, and unresolved, please like the video and subscribe. We post stories like this 3 times a week. And if you have your own theory about Atlantis, myth, memory, or something between, drop it in the comments, because the evidence may stop, but the questions don't.